Good morning, everyone. My name is Igor Kotler, and this event is organized by the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. This is a non-profit organization established about, Steve, 2 years ago, right? 2 years ago by Stephen Bronner. He is here, and Eric Goslan, who lives in France. And the idea of this organization is to help, I would say, warring sides and conflicting sides to negotiate through non-formal contacts, okay, non-official contacts. And the organization is involved, for example, in trying to resolve some conflict in Yemen. We talked to Iranian, Indians and Pakistanis. I'm talking with the organization with different Arab countries, Israelis and Palestinians. I'm in charge of the former Soviet Union and trying to establish contacts between Azeris and Armenians. So it's a variety of topics. It's number one. Number two, the organization has its educational programs in different areas of human rights, and including genocides and the Holocaust. And this is symposium number two. The first symposium was done among the members of the organization, and this one is number two. We are going to discuss achievements and failures of Holocaust education in the United States. Okay, and we have several distinguished panelists today, and the whole idea is to understand what was done, what we can do, and there's a question: should we do anything for this? Maybe not. And so many years passed, 75 years already since the Holocaust. So this is our today's topic, and I will introduce our speakers. The first speaker is Professor Stephen Bronner, who is the co-director of the organization, ICDD. Professor Bronner is a political scientist and political philosopher. He authors more than 25 books in the field, and he will talk about, his thoughts, and he will express his thoughts and ideas about Holocaust education in this country. After that, I would like to invite to talk Douglas Kirby. He's executive director of the New Jersey Commission Holocaust Education, and also teaching at the Stockton University. Doug Kirby is involved in Holocaust teaching for many years. He worked on the curricula in this area, and now he's heading this very important commission on out of, I believe, 12 or 15 in the United States only. Okay, after that, I would like to invite Dr. Jonathan Friedman. Jonathan Friedman used to work for the USH Museum, United States Memorial Museum Holocaust in Washington. After that, he was a historian at the Shaw Foundation in Los Angeles. Now he's a professor of Holocaust and, I believe, genocide studies at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. He wrote nine books, and he's very active in Holocaust studies. And to conclude our conversation, I would like to invite Dr. Douglas Smith, my old friend from UCLA. And Dr. Smith is a Russian historian. He wrote 6 books in Russian history, but recently he switched his academic and historical interest to the very complicated question of the fate of Jews in Vienna in 1938-1945, and he's working on a book in this area. And this would be very, I believe, important and valuable to understand what was the move, why you decided to do this, okay, and your I would say, view on the Holocaust education in this country. So let's start with Professor Bronner. Steve, please
Okay. Well,
start.
first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's very much appreciated. And I know Igor spent a good deal of time on this topic. It's one of 3 shows that he did. And this one is, I think, of particular importance because it questions some of the assumptions that we make about the achievement of the achievements of Holocaust education. I mean, it seems like every week there's another show on TV dealing with the Holocaust or another movie. And I sort of learned that there have been more than, sorry about this, spam call. There have been more than 50,000 there have been more than 50,000 books written about Hitler and the Holocaust. No one can possibly keep up with this. And it's clear that there's a kind of information overload on the one hand. And yet, on the other hand, we have about 10 to 15% of the country that never heard of the Holocaust. Another just under 50% who are unable to name a death camp or a ghetto, and another 50% that have seen some kind of Holocaust denial online. Clearly, there's something wrong. And the way I would frame this is there's too much recounting of the Holocaust and not enough that is of quality and that people remember and can remember. So if we're going to talk about the future of Holocaust education in terms of its possible achievements, I think the first thing we have to do is get out of a kind of insular set of assumptions made primarily by Jews, which is that this is the event that needs to be talked about. This is almost a good part of the definition of Jewish identity. There's no and as Adorno put it, Theodor Adorno, the great philosopher, there can be no poetry after Auschwitz. In other words, Auschwitz is the absolute evil that reflects the Jewish belief that you cannot speak about God, and so, or you cannot show God in any mimetic form. This is the similarity with regard to the Holocaust, but on the other side, it's defined by what it opposes. The worst evil, a God that can't be named, and now the worst evil that can't be named. We see this in the famous documentary by Claude Lanzmann, the Shoah, which it's only people talking. There's nothing in it about that depicts the Holocaust. It's 8 episodes, and I frankly don't know anyone except the real experts on the Holocaust who's seen the whole thing. On the other hand, we're in a situation where something like Night and Fog, the first film by the great Alain Resnais, who also did Hiroshima Mon Amour, the film, is 45 minutes, but people don't want to see it because of what it shows. It makes people uncomfortable. to see the bodies stacked, to see the skulls built in a pyramid, and so on. Again, we have a situation in which there's too much, but too little that directly speaks to the needs of people and to the reasons why we should see the Holocaust, why we should know anything about the Holocaust. The third point I want to raise is this. We make the assumption in education that we should bring in people who've experienced it. I grew up in Washington Heights in New York. Every second person I know, that it was a poor working class neighborhood. Every second person I know, I grew up with, lost someone in the Holocaust. None of those people could tell you how, what the dynamics of the Holocaust were, or how a concentration camp was directly organized, nor should they have to. These are not scholars. These are simple people. These are people who lived through it, and in a certain way, that's enough. But if we are going to teach people about the Holocaust, we have to know how it works, and we're not teaching people that. Think about the one book that's read by everyone. I always bring this up, which is Anne Frank. This is what kids read in high school. Well, and it's a very touching story about a very talented and in German you would say Tapfer, courageous young woman. But it doesn't speak to the Holocaust. It's almost like we have a virtual experience, a hyper experience, a hyper virtual experience, because that's not what the book is about. The book is about her. And so kids walk away. I've seen this, or I've heard about it constantly in my classes. Kids walk away having a feeling they know about something that they actually know nothing about. So for the future, and I'll close up here, I think we have a number of things to do. One, how do we make the Holocaust real and pertinent to people as the people who've experienced it die? Yeah. In other words, the very thing we've relied on all these years is not going to exist anymore. Secondly, we are in a larger world. Every nation, or almost every nation, has its Holocaust. There's no reason whatsoever why someone who has gone through, or who's had ancestors who've gone through the genocide in the Congo should pay obeisance to the Holocaust. We have to give them reasons why. And what that means is we have to show two things at the same time, which is precisely what we don't do. One, what makes the Holocaust unique? And two, what makes it pertinent to the human condition of genocide? If you think, you can think about this also in terms of literature. I know one novel that does this, and that's of course one that nobody reads, which is Andrei Schwartzbach's The Last of the Just, which allows you to see the individual, but also allows you to see the mass. It allows you to see what's particular about the Holocaust, and it also allows you to see what's human about it. That's the kind of thing we have to look for. And the third final thing is we have to be able to have more than a nostalgia for hell. We have to be able to show what is it that people can learn about from the Holocaust that will explicate their world further. And I'd be happy to go into all of this in question and answer, but that's what I think. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. So we will discuss all your presentations later with question and answers. Now, and I'm going through the alphabetical order. This is the best way to organize everybody to feel comfortable. So now I would like to ask Doug Kirby to continue this very important conversation.
I almost forgot to, like my students, I almost forgot to unmute myself. Well, Stephen, you have hit everything that we need to do in the state of New Jersey and the rest of the country with your observations.
Thank you.
And my job, along with the rest of the centers that we have in the state of New Jersey, are trying to address pretty much everything that you covered. And the dilemma, taking one step back, is that who's teaching the teachers what they're going to teach and how they're going to teach this.
Great.
And the dilemmas that they face when the student asks them, and they're very good at doing this, some very uncomfortable questions about why we're learning this. And in my 41 years when I taught in high school, I had 6 students, and I was lucky this didn't happen in the first 2 or 3 years, told me that it did not happen. And they were adamant that it did not happen and tried to substantiate their position. Now, if you have a first or second or third year teacher that one has a very limited background because they've got to cover from 1900, the age of imperialism, all the way up to now 2021, they're in a bind because how much time are we going to spend on all of this? Now we're in the process of revising our curriculums, and we know that most teachers are probably going to spend, based on talking with my college students, maximum 2 weeks. Now, some of them have had full year courses, but that's only been recently that's happened. Some have semester courses, which is only a recent thing. There's only 16 states that teach this by some sort of mandate or legislation in their states. I would say probably 10 of them within the last 3 years, 4 of them within the last 2 years. The last one is Delaware, which is about 2 months ago. And they're in a dilemma because they don't have the resources or have not spent the resources to teach the teachers what to teach and how to teach this. And then, like you said, they're overwhelmed with the amount of material. Like the curriculum that we have right now is 1,000 pages. You couldn't do that even if you wanted to. So how do we as a commission offer professional development for school districts on how they go about teaching this material? And there's some, and the people that are on the rewrite right now are some very, I'd say 10 years plus as far as how long they've been teaching at the high school level. And Anne Frank has pretty much dropped down to the grade school, middle schools, I would say. And then below that is Number the Stars, The Devil's Arithmetic, and that sort of thing. And then they're reading, some 8th graders are reading Night, which I have a little bit of an issue with. And usually freshman year, they might do Rwanda as part of their world history class. And then as they get to junior year, which is probably where they're going to do US 2, and they're going to cover World War II and the Holocaust. I've had students that have told me they spent 20 minutes on World War II, 20 minutes on the Holocaust, and they moved on to the Cold War and Vietnam. They're better off not doing it, than doing that. That's just a travesty in and of itself. So, and then our success, and even though we've been doing this since 1994 in the state of New Jersey, since myself and a little older are now out of the classrooms, is that the younger faculty have had limited exposure to Holocaust genocide classes at the collegiate level. So a lot of them basically are autodidactic in that they teach themselves. They bought into this. They had a course. Maybe let's say they went to Westchester or they went to Rutgers or they went to Stockton, and they're now going into the classroom and they want to spend more than 5 days. So then they've got a supervisory issue that they're dealing with, which maybe the supervisor says, you can't do that because you've got to cover all these other things. My one former principal told me teaching is pretty much a covert activity. When the door closes, you kind of do what you want anyway. So, and even my supervisor at one point says, you're spending a little bit too much time in this, aren't you? And I said, have you read the newspapers today? So our issue is, how do we get this material out to them? And we had a discussion on another program, is how do you assess the effectiveness of what you are doing? It's real easy when you're doing chemistry and math and algebra and so forth and geometry, because it's right there. Unless you're going to do a long-term longitudinal study of students that have had quality Holocaust genocide education in middle school, all right, or even before, 5th and 6th grade, they've Number the Stars, Devil's Arithmetic, 7th, 8th grade, into high school, haven't taken anything. How do you know what impact it had on them being, let's say, an upstander versus being a bystander? So you've got to keep track of all of these people for 20 years, I would suspect, which is probably not going to happen. So you have a lot of anecdotal information that all of us have, about students that we've seen X amount of years after they've graduated, either from high school or college, and said, this occurs and this is what I did. And there are numerous instances of that. But to do that as far as documentation, how do you assess that what you're doing in your classroom with juniors in high school will translate them being better people than after they graduated? And then you have the issue as far as the teachers with Maud taking 30 to 40 teachers over to Europe and having that experience definitely changes them one as a person, whether they're teaching or not. And then they come back to their classroom and they can show their students what it transpired as far as their experience. And then you have that personalization, because you can't teach 6 million dead Jews and 5 million dead non-Jews. It's got to be a personalization, how it affects them on a personal level. And I think that's what most of us try to do in our classroom, as far as developing relationship with the students that we teach, and then they take this information and they leave. I mean, I've brought in, Holocaust survivors. That whole process, whether they want to speak or not, is that you let them know, the students beforehand, that you've got to do your prep work. And if you're going to show a film like Night and Fog or Memory of the Camps, that has to be properly prepped, then shown and then discussed so they can internalize what they watch. All right. And then you have your exam at the end and so forth, to try to substantiate that you are assessing, on a short-term basis, at least, for a grade for your class. But the grade they get as a human being is down the road a piece. And I really, at this point, don't know how you assess that. I know how you possibly do it, but whether that's going to have the funding for that to take place is a whole nother matter. So that's where we are with the commission.
Thank you, Doug. It's very important, and especially to know more about the new generation and people who really were born after 2000. This we are talking about people who know only the 21st century, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. Now, next one, please, Jonathan Friedman. John, it's your time.
Thanks, Igor, and thanks to everyone for the invitation to participate. As the director of a Master of Arts program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at a regional university, I'd like to focus on an issue which I confront on a regular basis, and that's the issue of viability. Westchester University, for those of you who don't know, it's located in Westchester, Pennsylvania. It's a pretty college town about 30 miles west of Philadelphia. The university has approximately 15,000 students, and it is currently the largest university in the Pennsylvania state system, which does not include Penn State, Pitt, or Temple. But Westchester is also the only university in the system that has both a graduate and an undergraduate degree program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. It owes its existence to my former colleague, Dr. William Hewitt, who is a specialist in Native American history and genocide studies, and my predecessor, Dr. Irene Schur, who was one of the longest serving professors in the history of the Pennsylvania state system. She began teaching courses on the Holocaust in the 1960s, and her tireless efforts to create a degree program bore fruit in 2000 after decades of advocacy. And it seemed at the time that there was both a need and space for such a program. In 1996, the Pennsylvania State Assembly passed a resolution that recommended that the state's Department of Education incorporate Holocaust studies into its social studies standards. And this resulted in dozens of high school teachers signing up for the MA program in its first few years. Westchester was an obvious and not so obvious choice for such a program. The university has a connection to civil rights as the place where Frederick Douglass gave his last public speech. But apart from that, the university does not have a sizable Jewish student body or a Department of Jewish Studies. And so as a place to house a Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, it was at once an appropriate as well as a curious choice, dependent really on the work of one or two professors. And then two, when the program started, there was not much competition. In addition to Westchester, Richard Stockton College, now Stockton University, offered a master's program, and Clark University had the only doctoral program in the country in Holocaust Genocide Studies. I started teaching at Westchester in 2002, And from that year until 2008, there were at least 15 to 20 students in the program, which routinely made graduate courses almost too large to manage. Then the Great Recession hit and enrollments declined, but the program remained viable. I actually thought that the numbers from 2009 to 2014 were manageable, since graduate class sizes were now down to the high single digits to low double digits, which is more appropriate for a graduate seminar. In 2014, Pennsylvania joined Florida, California, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois as a state requiring the inclusion of Holocaust and genocide curricula in classrooms. However, the numbers in the graduate program kept declining, despite the new law and the urgency posed by the rise in anti-Semitism and authoritarian politics after 2016. Two recent factors have exacerbated the situation. The COVID-19 pandemic and the initiation of additional MA programs in Holocaust studies. We lost students who objected to the transition from in-person to online learning, and the fact that there are now dozens of graduate programs in Holocaust genocide studies across the globe, including 2 between Stockton and Westchester at Rowan University and Gratz College, means that the level of competition is that much greater. At the same time, the pool of potential applicants has not grown. Given the continued realities of racism and authoritarian politics around the globe, one would think that more students would be committed to studying a discipline such as Holocaust and genocide studies. And graduates from the program are continuing to find work in the field, both as educators and as advocates. Yet there appears to be a reluctance to pursue a degree that has a reputation for not being practical enough, or whose career options might appear limited. This is a common feeling that has impacted all disciplines in the humanities for decades. And graduates from the MA program in Holocaust genocide studies at Westchester and elsewhere are demonstrating that such a notion is falsifiable. Westchester graduates are working in the field at a number of institutions, including the Philadelphia Holocaust Awareness Museum and the Pittsburgh Holocaust Museum. Many have received doctorates from universities like the University of Tennessee, Arizona State University, Wayne State University, and are teaching full-time. And several are currently enrolled in doctoral programs, Lehigh University, George Mason University, and even at Clark University. There are clearly employment opportunities in the field, and with Pennsylvania's mandate to teach Holocaust education in Pennsylvania high schools, the program may indeed see an increase in enrollment over the next couple of years. But as I see it, the obsession with viability can easily produce a death spiral in which a small program cannot grow because it is seen as too small, and hence resources are taken away, thus causing it to contract further. If Westchester's Holocaust Genocide Studies program cannot survive as a standalone entity in this new environment of heightened competition and lower demand, perhaps aspects of the program can be preserved to serve a smaller constituency. This may mean creating a Holocaust Genocide Studies pathway within the existing History Master of Arts degree, but this program is shrinking as well. Perhaps allowing the program to remain small and niche, inherently important, with only a few graduates per year, with the trade-off of having faculty teach larger undergraduate sections to compensate is another possibility. Incorporating more online and synchronous remote modalities is another avenue to pursue. And while I was originally hesitant to go down this path, the transition to Zoom during the pandemic demonstrated that this could be an option for students unable to come to Westchester to live and study for 2 years. Whatever the solutions may be, changes in resource allocation and institutional culture are absolutely critical. These may not save the program or any program in a similar boat, but rejecting both can certainly accelerate a program's demise. And while we are not at that moment yet at Westchester, I feel we are uncomfortably close to it. So those would be my remarks, very local and targeted to Westchester.
And John, thank you very much. It's very important because we have great centers like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, but this is not the entirety of the United States. The vast majority of people live in smaller places and study in many, many, many colleges. Like, I don't know how many, thousands and thousands. And it's very important reflection for us. And we'll discuss it a little bit more today, I believe, also a few minutes. And now, my pleasure to ask Doug Smith, to talk about his experience, his thoughts, and Doug, floor is yours.
Thanks, Igor. It's nice to be here. I feel like I've landed in the wrong Zoom talk. I'm not a Holocaust scholar. I have never taught the Holocaust. As Igor said, I'm a Russian historian. Got my PhD in Russian history at UCLA back in the 90s. And just as I have like no connection personally really to the Holocaust or to Jewish history, I have no connection to Russia or Russian history either. I seem to like studying things that are outside sort of my own biographical connection or biological family connection, if you will. I'm kind of here in some weird way because of bad American TV, or what some would call bad American TV. I grew up on a steady diet of Hogan's Heroes. I don't know, some of you maybe have seen Hogan's Heroes.
Yeah.
That sitcom. That was what got me interested in learning Russian when I was a little German as a little kid. So I took German in high school, growing up in Minnesota. And then I went off to college at the University of Vermont, and I ended up doing a double major in German and Russian languages and literatures. I had the really good fortune, and I didn't realize it at the time when I was just an undergraduate student, to have an opportunity to take part in a small lecture with Raoul Hilberg, one of the greatest or the greatest Holocaust scholars, started Holocaust studies, if you will, who spent his whole academic career at the University of Vermont. I remember him saying at the beginning of the talk that he had grown interested in the whole question of the Holocaust while a graduate student, and his advisor telling him, why are you wasting your time on a subject that is really not central to the story of World War II? And obviously he did not listen to that advice, thankfully, and went on to write sort of the definitive work on the Holocaust. As a German major, I decided I needed to go spend time in a German-speaking country, and where everyone else in my university wanted to go to Germany, I decided to be different and to go to Austria. So I went and spent a year studying in Vienna from 1983 to 1984. And it was interesting at the time because living there in those days, there was no public references to the Holocaust or really even to World War II. It was as if those years had never happened as you moved about the city. But I enjoyed my time. And so after graduating, I got a job with the Fulbright Commission to go back to Vienna and work as an English language teacher, and was hired to teach at the Theresianum, which is one of the great gymnasiums there in Austria. And I was there in 1985, 1986, when the lid blew off on Austria's myth of itself as sort of Hitler's first victim. It was when Kurt Waldheim, former head of the UN, ran for president of Austria. And the scandal of his past, which he had done much to try to hide, literally exploded. And Austria was finally forced to take a long, hard look at its past and what exactly had happened from 1938 to 1945. So it was interesting for me to be able to compare Vienna 83, 84, which was still very much living with its head in the sand, if you will, to a certain degree, with what happened in 85 and 86 when I was there. And it kind of opened my eyes to this degree to which, societies can live without really exploring their past. And it's something that kind of stuck with me all the years when I went on then later to write books on Russian history. I should say that I'm not a teacher. I'm not a professor. I have a doctorate, but I've chosen to write and research. And what I try to do in my work is to combine what I think is the best practices of academic scholarly research and writing with powerful storytelling to craft books that speak to the average reader, my mom, my wife, who are interested but are not professionals, yet at the same time to do it at a very high level that makes it an addition to scholarship. And this is what I've tried to do in my books about Russia, and it's what I'm trying to do now in a new book that I'm writing, just beginning on the story of what happened to Vienna's Jews from 1938 to 1945. And to a point that you made, Professor Braun, earlier, about the need to explain how it works, if you will, that to simply tell the story of a victim or to hear the testimony of a victim without the larger context, I think fails to really explain to people what happened, why it happened, how it happened, that sort of thing. And so that's what I've set out to do with this new book, which I'm just starting to write. I'm calling it The City Without Jews. And if you'll indulge me for a minute or two, I just wanted to read a little bit of what I'm working on as sort of the beginning lead-in to the book. And what I do is I start with an exploration of, I gotta figure out how I'm gonna hold this, an exploration of how my apartment in Vienna in 1983, 1984 is connected to this history of the Jews in Vienna, even though when I lived there, there was no way I probably would have known it. And I only know it now due to research and Austria's own attempts to face up to its history. So it goes, I want to start something like this. If upon leaving my apartment, I had turned left instead of right, within a minute or two, I would have come to Langegasse. It was here, 3 blocks down the street in the direction of the Palais Auersberg, that a young man, thin, with slicked back dark hair, stood waiting on the street outside the offices of Bettauer's Weekly on the afternoon of March 10th, 1925. Upon the arrival of Mr. Bettauer around 3 o'clock, the man followed him up the stairs and into his office, telling Bettauer that he had a letter for him. Bettauer took the letter and began to read, at which point the man locked the office door, pulled a Mauser from his briefcase, and fired 5 shots at point-blank range. Days later, Bettauer died from his wounds. He was the first Austrian Jew to die at the hands of a Nazi. The murder of Bettauer did not come as a surprise. For nearly a year, the nationalist press and right-wing politicians had been calling for it. On the floor of the Vienna City Hall, he had been denounced as, quote, that Jew Bettauer, responsible for unleashing, quote, a true plague epidemic of shameless filth that was rotting our German Christian nation, end quote. When, after months of calls to silence Bettauer failed to convince the authorities to act, his anti-Semitic foes decided it was time to take matters into their own hands. Otto Rothschock, aged 21, was a dental assistant and until the end of 1924, a member of the Nazi Party. At his trial, he told the court that he had murdered Bettauer to protect young people from the harm caused by the dead man's writings. One local newspaper called Rothschock's act, quote, the revenge of our insulted morality, end quote. To many, he was a national hero. The jury found the assailant not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was sentenced to 2 years in an asylum. Born into a Jewish family in Baden near Vienna, Hugo Bettauer had converted to Christianity as a young man, but this did nothing to change Austrians' perceptions of him as a Jew. A rebellious figure, he bounced back and forth for years between Europe and the United States, establishing for himself a reputation as a muckraking journalist, ready to take on the mighty and the powerful, fearless in exposing corruption, hypocrisy, and rot wherever he found it. He was a champion of the downcast, a defender of the marginalized. He preached sexual liberation and equality of the sexes. Along with his weekly, he churned out a stream of novels, which, even if they didn't impress the critics, sold well. One of them, which Rothschock had told the court had left him particularly indignant, was called The City Without Jews, a novel from the day after tomorrow. Published in 1922, The City Without Jews describes a Vienna of the near future, after anti-Semitic politicians have come to power on a slogan of, quote, throw out the Jews, as the answer to Austria's chronic woes of unemployment, inflation, and overcrowding. The National Parliament passes a law giving the Jews 1 year to immigrate. They're forced to leave their homes, stripped of their possessions, and either forcibly marched over the border or crowded onto trains and shipped off. At first, a wave of joy sweeps over the capital, but soon euphoria gives way to regret as the city's cultural life dies out. The cafes sit empty, and after an initial burst of activity, the economy sinks back into stagnation. Chastened by the stupidity of their actions, Austria's politicians rescind the ban, and the Jews are eventually welcomed back to Vienna. Bettauer's satire was an enormous success, selling over 250,000 copies. In the United States, a reviewer for the New York Times dismissed the novel as, quote, glib and cheap, quote, a work that deliberately strains after a sensationalist and controversial subject, end quote. The very premise, Jews being forcibly removed from Austria, was dismissed as unbelievable. At the time, no one could imagine a scenario like the one depicted in Bettauer's novel to be possible. But this book proved prophetic, more so than Bettauer himself could have imagined. If the city of Jews got things wrong, it wasn't in overestimating the lengths Austrians would go to be rid of their Jewish countrymen, but just the opposite, in failing to consider just how far their hatred would take them down the road of expropriation, expulsion, and mass murder. Between 1938 and 1945, the Jews of Vienna, where some 90% of the country's Jewish population lived, were subjected to unfathomable violence and terror. What for centuries had been a vibrant, influential, and diverse community would be destroyed. Of the approximately 100,090 Jews in Austria before 1938, only a few thousand would be left by the end of the war. The rest have been chased to the four corners of the earth, driven to suicide, or deported to the east to be shot, gassed, or starved to death. So that's sort of how part of what I'm envisioning as the beginning of the book. And again, back to some of the points that had been made about how to think about the Holocaust, how to maybe teach the Holocaust. What I want to do in the book is, again, to speak to people that are not professionals, are not experts, that know something about this story, but to give them the larger context, to give them the larger why and how behind it in a way that also can allow them to engage with concrete individual lives. And I'll just end by noting that there's going to be a central figure to my story that is situated within this context. An incredible story of a woman named Mignon Langnas, who was born in Galicia in the outer fringes of the Habsburg Empire in 1903, then moves with her family to Vienna, and miraculously survives the entire Nazi period in Vienna, working as a nurse in one of the few Jewish hospitals that is allowed to operate all the way up until 1945, when she manages to eventually get to the United States, to which her family has escaped during these war years. And I've made contact with her son, and the woman left behind an incredible, rich archive of letters and documents and photographs. And that will be sort of the central piece. But I hope through the book that it does, in some level, add to our education, add to our knowledge, and do it in a way that people can then make sense of the larger horror of the whole thing, and see it again in all the myriad complexities of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doug. And I believe we have a few minutes. Our audience is not so big today, but first of all, to the audience, do you have any questions to our speakers? I mean, you can speak right now, you ask, or any comments from the audience? No. Okay, fine. But I would like to summarize a little bit and to raise a few questions too. First of all, probably I will go now against, I was going to, according to the alphabet, now against the alphabet. So, Doug, question for you. I mean, it's very important. Your book is kind of a conclusion of a series of books of history of Jews of Vienna. There is a whole literature. It's a whole subject. I'm talking about Jewish studies. And The City Without Jews, it's a very dramatic, I would say, title. Very dramatic, okay? Because there are many cities like that in Europe, okay, and sounds very tragic. But now, as a person from outside of Holocaust education, and this is exactly why it was one of the reasons why I invited you to this session, okay? What is your just very briefly, your opinion about how it's important and why it's important, if it's important for the United States as of today. If you have any ideas or thoughts about this.
Well, I mean, this has been touched on by some of the other speakers today. I mean, the kinds of things that we're seeing in our political discourse now over the past 6 years, the level of sort of white nationalism, anti-Semitism, racism, which has been normalized by political leaders, our last president, a good case in point. You know, these are things that we can, I feel like we can never let our guard down in a sense. You know, there's one of the few memorials that was put up in Vienna in the 1950s dedicated to what had happened there. You know, the top words are niemals vergessen, never forget. And in a way that can almost maybe over time start to ring as a cliche or a hackneyed phrase on some level. But I think that is something that is central to all this. I mean, I think anyone who's really looking with open eyes at what is going on in this country now has to be shocked and horrified again at the you know, the bigotry and racism and anti-Semitism that is being allowed to percolate. I won't claim that I have an answer, and I will say that I feel entering into the subject now for my book and my research, I feel a bit like a man walking blindly into a minefield because I'm not an expert in all this. So I'm trying to, you know, become one as quickly as I can. And you're right that there is already a large literature on Vienna, but what I've noticed in my reading and where I hope my book will be an addition is you have on the one hand scholarly literature on the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Austria, which is really important, but is read by a very small group of people. And then on the other hand, you sort of have either memoirs of survivors and Jews who lived through this and managed to escape, or maybe accounts of someone's parents or grandparents who went through this. So hyper individualized perspectives. So on one hand, scholarly literature, and then sort of the memoiristic literature. And what I hope to do is create something a bit different as a work that has all of the scholarly insights and complexity to it, and then combines it with the very powerful and the very personal in a way that I hope will give a different perspective on the problem. And I hope will be well enough written and engaging enough that it finds a good size audience.
Okay, thank you. Now, my next question to Doug Friedman. I mean, yes, Jonathan Friedman, sorry, so many Dougs today, so Jonathan. John, yes, validity of Holocaust studies is a very important question. It's a pressing question. Yeah, we talked in private. You told me about the decreasing number of students, and we know about this approach that Holocaust studies, historical studies, humanities are not practical. Okay, and young generation is very, very kind of interested and engaged with computer stuff because of the Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that. It's very, very, very so. And the picture you showed, it's kind of, not I would say pessimistic, but it's kind of sobering, let me put it this way. But do you see any kind of, I mean, how would you formulate, let me put it this way, very briefly, necessity of the studies? Why do we still need these studies? Why do we still need specialists in this field?
I think that I spoke to that, and Doug mentioned it with the prevalence of authoritarian politics since 2016, and the increase in anti-Semitism, hate crimes, racism. I mean, to me, this is a values crisis, and I don't understand, you know, why capitalism cannot make a space for the study of ethics, and to have that study translate into application, that study translate into a career. The discourse at the university is, what can your discipline do to serve the economic interests of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? And so it's pegged to that kind of application career discourse, and that translates easily for the STEM disciplines. But why a discipline like ethics, something like human rights, something that this is obviously very much in that orbit? Why that cannot break through and be seen as just as viable? Why science, technology, math, engineering, it's taken for granted that those are viable disciplines to study because then there's an application at the end. This, to me, is not only inherently viable, but it demonstrably viable in that same kind of discourse, that there is just as much of a possibility to apply what you've learned to the world and to serve, the interests of changing consciousness and human rights. So I think my frustration is that you're constantly having to prove your worth, and when you have to do that at a university, I understand that if you were at a for-profit business, but at a university, when you're confronted with that persistent need to justify your existence and study this topic, that's when that's when I feel that there's as I said, a crisis in values. And if it's at a place of higher learning, then it's going to be even more pervasive in the real world. And I think that's what I was speaking to when I said that we need an institutional culture change and a broader culture change to value this as something that people should be able to go into study and make a living from.
Igor, can I jump in with a question?
Sure. It's an open discussion.
Jonathan, one thing I was wondering, and again, since I'm not at a university, I'm ignorant a lot of these things, but talking about viability and how these programs are justified and all that. I mean, is there a move within the academy to sort of make it more focused on genocide studies per se, so that you can then speak to, we have no shortage of those, right? And bring the Holocaust studies within this larger umbrella, which to viability, to speaking to deans and things like that about justifying departments and programs. Is that kind of thing happening? What do you see?
So that's one of the additional possibilities that I didn't mention that would it would be a potential solution. Westchester has a peace and conflict studies major that seems to be a growth field, and I think that when you see students going into a field like that, or women and gender studies, that's where then the energy and then the resources are directed to, and when they see, well, what is Holocaust and genocide studies if we already have peace and conflict studies, and that might be an avenue to merge at least the curriculum into that, so that at least that the subject gets taught. My fear is that it would just wither, and I'm on a 4 or 5 year plan before retirement, and there's a real concern that once I retire, then the Holocaust will not be taught anymore. They might teach issues of human rights very generally. They'll teach peace and conflict studies, but they won't even teach genocide studies because we don't have a dedicated specialist in genocide studies. When you peg a program just to one person, then that's not a recipe for sustained success.
That's certainly true.
Thank you, John. And now it's not so easy, Doug. Okay, but don't worry, no mistakes. You told us about the state of Holocaust education in the state of New Jersey and programs, and this is a law in New Jersey, right? It's very important. And I believe, I hope I didn't miss it or misunderstood that you try to explain to your students and American kids who grew up in, I would say, prosperous, completely prosperous state and good life, how not to be bystanders, right? And uh, my question is the following. Um, what is the perception of American students, of these teenagers? And again, you work, I'm not talking about Stockton, I'm talking about high schools. You work with kids for whom what happened in the 20th century, it happened in the last century. This is a big problem because we are people who were born in the 20th century. For us, the events of the 20th century are more or less our events. But for example, I don't know, the war for civil war in the United States, it's 19th century, it's long time ago. I'm from Russia, for me, like Napoleonic Wars. Well, guys, it's a piece of history not related. So tell me, how would you, what is their perception and how you try to work it out to make it closer to them? I mean, you talked about it, but and what's so important? Just I would like very brief summary of that, like the whole idea.
The pedagogical director at Yad Vashem was Shulamit Embar, and she said you can't, that's why I had mentioned before, you can't teach 11 million people. So you must personalize it for your students so that they can see and relate, even though this is an event that took place 75 to 80 years ago when it began in 1933. And it has been mentioned by several of the people that have spoken today, is that the political climate that we're in, I mean, the number of times that I think I've written on Facebook, I feel like I'm living in 1930s Germany, is just frightening. And the students have made that connection so that, and you're always fighting in the social studies area and the humanities against the science and math because social studies is not tested. So if it's not tested, it must not be important then. Unfortunately, we're probably the most important area where we're teaching morals and values and ethics and empathy and understanding. Not that you can't do those in chemistry, physics, and algebra and geometry and Spanish class, but since it's not tested, that becomes an issue. And as Jonathan has mentioned, you always have to like fight for your worth and why your courses should be taught, which is unfortunate because universities are a business to a certain extent that you need students, you have to pay the faculty, the lights, and so on down the line. I never really had a problem. Kids would come in the first or second day of class asking, when are we going to cover the Holocaust? I said, well, I've got to do a lot of other things before we get there. And that gets to the point that Doug had mentioned, is that how do you keep this relevant to a generation that it's ancient history for them? It's almost like teaching the Civil War. But once you can personalize that for them, and even with the college students, it's the same thing, then it's no longer, I'm talking about an abstract. It's now, this could happen to me. I can be marginalized. I can be the other. I have students that are handicapped, even this semester, and you go over what happened. That the first people murdered were not the Jews, okay, were the mentally and physically disabled with the T4 program. And then I have students that are going into the medical fields. So you're getting, the propaganda and so forth from the government. Are you going to buy into what they're selling, or are you going to step up to the plate and say, no, I'm not participating in that? And I try to get them, which I know you can't do, but with ABC does a thing, and what would you do type programs. And you give those students that ability, you stop the film and say, okay, what are we going to do? And they say, well, I don't know. I said, well, that's not a point. You can't say, I don't know. You need to make a decision. Are you going to step up and be an upstander? Okay, or are you going to step aside and let that event take place? At the same token, I don't want them, if they see somebody with a gun in Wawa, okay, to jump out and say, Serby said I should do something. That's why you have a cell phone. You call 911. Now let's be, smart about some of this. But at the same token, if you see one of your coworkers that's being mistreated by somebody, are you going to just blow that off and say, pretty much let the bully go? Or are you going to step in and get involved? And at the same token, we see what happens when somebody doesn't step up with the political. I mean, it's interesting that people are trying to blow off the January 6th event in the United States about it wasn't that bad. I mean, I've spoken to some Holocaust survivors, and they felt after they saw that they heard German boots that night and the nightmares that they were having, that they're reliving something they never thought was plausible to take place in the United States. I mean, it's just frightening. But I think that can be addressed and properly addressed by education, where you don't have to substantiate why your class is important, because the students want to know. I mean, I never have a problem filling up my class, which maybe, and that's the same thing with all the classes at Stockton. I mean, we don't have enough spaces for, like if we probably need more faculty, because there's 1,000 students that are educated every year on Holocaust genocide classes and also Jewish studies. I have one Jewish student. I'm not Jewish. I didn't know anything about the Holocaust until I was a senior in college. And they want to know. I mean, they are very engaged with this subject. A lot of them, I've had former students that have been in Europe on business, and they've said to their friends, I want to go to Dachau. And they go, wait a second, you want to go where? They go, well, I had this class and I met a survivor that was at Dachau, or I met a liberator that liberated Dachau. I want to go visit this place. So they've made that connection, but I guess that's part of our job to make sure that those things occur.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. And the last question for Steve. Steve, you mentioned about the problems with education, that the lack of knowledge sometimes is quite visible in the United States. It's one part. And my question for you, like for others, and you work in the area of human rights for many years, and how would you connect the work in this area, human rights, with the topic of the Holocaust? Because again, it was a historical event 75 years ago or so, and also probably that's enough. This is my major question.
Okay. You know, the term genocide was actually coined by Raphael Lemkin, and that happened after the war. And he wrote up the section in for the UN Charter dealing with genocide. And what he had in mind was the Holocaust, what we think of as the Holocaust, but also the Russian liquidation of so many different groups and the like. And what he didn't do was draw any distinctions at all between the two. And one of the reasons it's so difficult to talk about genocide, why you hear it so rarely from the UN. Now you hear it a little more, but to little effect. And the reason is because originally, if a situation was deemed a genocide, the UN had to go in. And that, of course, is something that very few people want, and very few nations want to accept, and even fewer want to supply forces for. The second element, and here I don't mean to criticize with regard to the people saying that, or Holocaust survivors saying the American situation was like Germany. This is something that German Jews always say. Any event, it could be Ronald Reagan, it could be anything else. Now I'm Hitler. That was what I grew up with. You know, when I was a kid, there was no. This was the standard or the objective reference for every political crisis. That's insufficient, because it's not like the Weimar Republic, the United States. I mean, it's neither that way in terms of its structure. It's neither that way in terms of the forces fighting. And it's not that way in terms of, if you like, the the overwhelming climate. This is different. And it's different from Austria also, I fear. We have to begin to specify what it is that that could have been done. For example, if you want to discuss it in these terms, what could have been done to prevent Hitler concretely? Not some guy standing up at the Bahnhof, for example. What were the political decisions that could have been made that would have prevented Hitler from coming to power? For example, the social democracy, which was the only movement by 1930 that was clearly anti-totalitarian. It was left in the lurch. No one would support it. It was the only meaningful political alternative to the Nazis by 1932. Communists wouldn't support it. Conservatives wouldn't support it, and liberals were shaky about it. You can empirically check this, had the communists and the socialists formed a popular front, it would have had more votes than the Nazis. Almost exactly more votes than when the communists went sectarian that they provided. Now we have to approach it in these terms. For example, if you want to bring an individual into it, in 1925, there was an election, and Wilhelm Marx, who was a liberal, ran against a conservative candidate. Social Democrats decided to support him. Communists decided to oppose him. The other candidate came in with almost exactly the amount of votes that the communists cast for their own candidate. The guy that was brought in was Hindenburg. We didn't have that. We don't have the army in the same circumstance as existed in the Weimar Republic. These are the structural things that I think require explication. Nor do we have a crisis of sovereignty anywhere near what the Weimar Republic had. We never had, if you want to think about the horror of the uprising, we never had a situation like in 1918 in Germany or in Austria, where there was a fundamental, almost a civil war between Republicans, social democratic Republicans, and more radical elements of the workers' movement who supported the Soviets. And I don't mean the communists here. I mean honest to God's workers' councils, which were democratic. This undermined the Weimar Republic from the beginning because it caused the reactionary army, which refused to take responsibility for World War I, from coming in and crushing, basically forcing compromises by the Social Democrats and crushing the more radical elements. Dachau was built in Munich. Munich was the most liberal city in Germany. What happened? What happened was that these reactionary forces focused in 1918, 1919 on Munich, on the Munich uprising. And the entire left was basically knocked out. And all those great intellectuals like Bertolt Brecht and Piscator and so on moved up to Berlin. And that's how Berlin became the center. I mean, I'm talking about that kind of stuff that has to be brought to bear, because I think the connection with the January 6th thing, I really think it's specious, if I can say so. At least that's my view. And what I mean by the workings of the Holocaust, I mean the structural dynamics that are involved. We have plenty of great memoirs. I've brought people into my classes to talk about about the Holocaust, including my uncle, who was in 4 different camps, you know, including the Death March. He's now 97 and living in Florida. He told of his experience. At the end of the day, I had a kid come up to me from Africa and say, what was unique? Why is that different from what I went through? My family went through in the 1960s. There's no reason for my uncle to provide an answer. We have to provide the answer, at least from what I can see, because without that, we're not going to have an honest evaluation of the relevance of that event. But I could be wrong.
So if I could just interject and ask Stephen, what do you think of Tim Snyder's view of, because with the use of the attack on the press, the fake news and the use of the big lie, those as analogs?
Didn't you have that under Pinochet or under Mussolini? This is not. And by the way, I should add one other thing, Jonathan. I think the analysis of the Holocaust has to be taken from the standpoint of resistance. Somebody mentioned this. Actually, I think you did, that it's a way of resisting terrible things that are happening today. I agree with that. But then one has to come up with what form of resistance you want people to take. Is identity politics enough? Do we need, what kind of value? I totally agree with you that we have a crisis of values, but that begs the questions, what values do you want to teach, right? So, I mean, that's how I would approach it. It's very interesting. If you think about the United States, and you think about Germany, and you think about Italy, and you think about Chile, and you think about Austria, the class basis for all these movements in these different countries are basically the same. And your question is a great question. If I can, sorry to sort of babble on, but your question was a great question. Why can't capitalism provide an ethic, a class in ethics? I think that's exactly right. The problem is that the classes and the ideologies picked up by these classes are pre-modern, are pre-capitalist. And that's why I think liberals have such a difficulty sort of putting themselves in the place of those white nationalists and those neo-fascists. Because basically they're modern people, cosmopolitan people like yourselves, coming from probably, I know Westchester a little bit, sort of sophisticated college environments or urban environments. And here you have these the bases. You can see it on, when you look at the January 6th thing. You have these people coming from obviously pre-modern circumstances, and pre-capitalist, non-urban, agrarian, petty bourgeois, small town circumstances. That would be the similarity, perhaps, in talking about this. Yeah, but then you got to go to the political thing, how to resist it. That's very hard because we're not taught to think that way, I fear. So sorry about that. I hope that was okay.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So let me conclude our conversation that I believe that we covered enormous number of questions. Okay, seriously. We talked about very different, I would say, sides of the of Holocaust education. We talked about universities. We talked about schools. We talked about historical research and historical literature, let me put this way. And what we come up with a very important question of ethics, okay, how it's connected. Probably we looked in the very core of the problem, okay, not just a historical event as the Holocaust, and there were many events similar to that, and Armenian genocide, and we can, like Doug said, Doug Smith, that uh, there are so many of them to talk about. And I believe that we are involved in a very important studies and educational process, which should be continued in the 21st century, because these historical events are related to our lives, okay, and to developments in this country too. And again, ethics and history and understanding who we are. And I believe we will continue this conversation in a different kind of way, because I'm not going to reveal it, but I got some ideas listening to you, and Steve knows that when I'm trying to push something through, I'm usually successful with this. Okay, so, and at this moment, I would like to thank everyone for participation. I believe uh, it was very engaging and enriching conversation for all of us. And believe me, we'll continue this conversation. Okay. Thank you very much, and much success to everyone.